For the last several months, the war in Ukraine has basically turned into an artillery slugging match, more reminiscent of World War I than any modern war. There have been a few large, successful advances, especially recently, but the rest of the front has remained pretty much static. A big part of what brought about the end of trench warfare and artillery duels of World War I was aircraft. The much more capable aircraft of World War II meant that a defender couldn't just sit still and dig in. They had to be on the move. And for the most part, that's been true ever since, until now. One of the major reasons Russia is struggling in Ukraine is its lack of air superiority. They've been unable to adequately disable Ukraine's air force and air bases, destroy their decision-making centers, or degrade Ukraine's supply lines, all of which makes the job for Russia's ground forces much more difficult. Why is this? Russia has, at least on paper, the second largest air force on Earth, as well as one of the most capable and experienced. Yet, it seems nowhere to be found. Where is it? And what is it doing? But first, real quick, our sponsor, Policy Genius. The older I get, the more I learn I need to start dealing with grown-up subjects. They're no fun. One is life insurance, which sounds even less fun and hard work to figure out. But Policy Genius makes it incredibly easy. Their team of licensed experts will help you understand your options, working with you, not the insurance companies, and also handle all the paperwork and scheduling for free. Even if you have no clear need for it right now, which is often the excuse I use, life insurance typically gets more expensive the older you get, so it's important to take care of it as soon as possible. It can save you a ton of money in the long run. Also, despite rising inflation, life insurance rates are actually down from this time last year, making it the perfect time to knock this important one off your adulting list. Policy Genius can get you covered in as little as 1 week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. So do yourself and loved ones, or future loved ones, a favor. Go over to policygenius.com/covercabal and see what's available. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. Options start at just $17 per month for $500,000 of coverage. Again, Policy Genius. First, a quick overview. The Russian military has 3 main branches: the ground, navy, and aerospace forces. Aerospace is then broken down into 3 more: space, air and missile defense, and then finally their air force. Their navy also has an air component, however it's mostly made up of aircraft used to defend its shores from enemy warships and submarines. But to get onto the details, according to Military Balance 2021, their air force consists of about 1,160 combat-capable aircraft. Those are roughly 185 strictly fighter aircraft, 264 attack, and 415 multi-role, which can do both, and then 119 bombers. They also have hundreds of attack helicopters, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to skip them. Their bombers are not really playing a major role. Right now, they're really just large missile carriers that launch from several hundred kilometers away, which is similar in a sense to their naval ships firing Caliber cruise missiles. These typically strike fixed strategic targets like command and control, air bases, and also factories. But Ukraine has done a good job at dispersing its command, and also a lot of their weapons come from the west, so these strikes are not as effective. And the fact that Ukraine still operates at least a somewhat capable air defense network means the typically slower and less agile bombers are not able to fly over targets and drop bombs without being shot down. So again, they're basically just another large missile platform like warships. Their fighters are not much use either. Ukraine's small, remaining air force has mostly stuck to quick and low-altitude strikes and then quickly returning back to base, not giving much time for Russia to detect or intercept them. And if we look at Oryx's list of confirmed losses, it's no surprise that none of them are strictly fighters or bomber aircraft. They're all attack and multi-role, with the exception of 1 transport. Ukraine claims they've destroyed 237 aircraft, but there's only been about 50 combat aircraft destroyed that's been verified with pictures. So if we stick with that lower confirmed number, that leaves roughly 629 attack and multi-role aircraft. Now, not every aircraft was sent to fight in Ukraine, and not every aircraft is in operational condition. US aircraft availability rates are often somewhere around 50% depending on how it's calculated. When preparing for a war though, additional maintenance will be done and boost up that number to much higher, maybe 80%. If we assume these rates in Russia are similar, which they probably aren't, and they're probably a lot lower due to the older average age of each aircraft, that would leave them with around 500. Of that, it seems reasonable to assume that either 250 to 300 were assigned to Ukraine, which would leave the rest still to defend Russia's airspace elsewhere. Russia has just an incredible number of airbases, but they need to be close enough to be able to reach their targets with a payload and fly back. Ukraine's air defenses also require them to fly low, which will shorten their range. Russia also doesn't have a large tanker fleet, so which airbases they can use has to be within range of the aircraft's own range. Russian strike and multi-role aircraft's combat radius for a high, low, high strike profile on average is roughly 600 kilometers. That would vary a lot depending on the aircraft and the payload it's carrying, but this leaves us with these airbases within range of the front. And then realistically, these are the airbases within range of likely targets right now in the east and south, and also the airbases set up to operate strike aircraft. So, with all that said, how does that compare with the US? Really, there are only two wars we can compare it to, both in Iraq. The Gulf War in 1991 is probably the best. Russia today is likely closer in technology to the US in 1991 in terms of targeting pods, the amount of precision-guided munitions, integration with support aircraft like jammers, recon, surveillance, and AEW, as well as their ground forces. Also, Iraq had a much more capable air defense network than it did in 2003 when it had been degraded over the years. So, a few things about the Gulf War. One is that most people forget it was basically just one giant air war for the US. The air campaign went on for 43 days, while the ground campaign only went on for the last 4. During those 43 days, the US conducted about 40,000 air-to-ground sorties. That comes out to nearly 1,000 a day. The 1,011 strike aircraft means each aircraft averaged roughly 1 sortie per day. If again we assume a similar rate, that would mean Russia could conduct around 250 sorties per day. Whether they're actually doing that though is difficult to determine, but that's 4 times less than the rate of the Gulf War. Ukraine is also larger in size and has more than twice the population that Iraq did in 1991, which would imply that there's probably many more targets that need to be hit. Conducting an air campaign to the same degree as the Gulf War in Ukraine could therefore require somewhere around 2,000 sorties per day to have the same effect, and that's something Russia just isn't even close to ever being able to achieve. Losses and damage by enemy action for the US was 1.7 aircraft per every 1,000 strikes overall. Most of that though was from the first week when they were aggressively going after Iraq's air defense sites. Without knowing Russia's sortie rate, it's hard to tell. 250 a day for 200 days and losing 50 aircraft gives a loss rate of 1 per every 1,000 sorties. Realistically though, that sortie rate per day is probably lower, which means a higher loss rate, possibly closer in line with what the US experienced. But it's also worth noting that the 43 days of the Gulf War is much shorter than the 200 plus days the war in Ukraine has been going on. Keeping up such a high sustained rate of sorties for a long period of time puts a lot of stress on the aircraft, their engines, equipment, and the crews trying to keep them running. Crews need to be rotated out, and the airframes need to be brought back to a factory for more intensive maintenance. It's unlikely that even the US could have kept up such a high rate for over 6 months straight without a huge increase of aircraft, spare parts, and maintenance crews brought in. It's hard to figure out what sortie rate Russia would be able to sustain over time. It'd really depend on their maintenance facilities, available spare parts and replacement engines, number and quality of maintenance crews, and so on. Then also the number of valid targets they can find and available munitions. But a real rough guess could put their sortie rate on average about 150 or less per day, which again is a far cry from what is likely required to make a real difference in the war. So what have those aircraft been doing, and how effective are they? At the start of a war, you typically want to do 3 things: knock out your enemy's air defenses, air bases, and command and control. That way you can conduct your own air operations over the country with near impunity, and any defenses remaining will be in disarray without command and control centers. Russia did attempt this in the beginning, but they were not very successful in the long run. Ukraine had roughly 18 air bases. I looked at satellite imagery and verified that each one was either struck, captured, or too close in proximity to the front to be of use all in the first month. However, air bases are not easy targets due to their size. You could try to hit the parked aircraft, but they could be moved in the meantime, and more can always be flown in, and it doesn't shut down the airbase. You can hit the runways, which could shut it down temporarily, but those craters could be patched in a matter of hours or even days at most. You can strike the ammo and fuel dumps, which would have a longer term effect, but these can be delivered to support at least some operations from the base, or HQ, air traffic control, radars, communications, etc., which would make operations more difficult but not impossible. Russia seems to have struck a mix between runways and parked aircraft, again giving credence to the idea that Russia thought this war would be over quickly. It's also worth noting that there's dozens of other civilian airports that could be adapted to operate aircraft out of. It seems pretty clear that, likely with US intelligence, Ukraine knew the invasion was imminent and dispersed many of its aircraft to avoid being destroyed on the ground. But I looked at satellite imagery again of every base in all the months since, and it seems air activity has restarted at least 8 of these air bases, mostly in western Ukraine, which is furthest away from the front. With a protracted war like this, it means you need to not only strike, but continue striking these air bases to keep your enemy from challenging you in the air, something that Russia has not been able to do. Ukraine also appears to regularly rotate their aircraft between bases to make targeting them much more difficult. This has all left Ukraine's Air Force continuing to operate, posing a threat to Russian forces. Now, there's a big gap between what Russia claims to have destroyed and what's been verified. Of Ukraine's 145 total fixed-wing aircraft, Russia claims to have destroyed 293, which makes it difficult to judge. There's been no officially confirmed transfers of aircraft to Ukraine. Some initial confusion was later clarified that only spare parts had been sent, not full aircraft. But it is possible that some might have been sent without official acknowledgement. But of the 145, 112 are combat aircraft. Oryx has at least 41 of those being lost, leaving 71. Either way, it's clear that Ukraine's Air Force is still operational. While it doesn't present a huge threat to Russia, it makes Russia's job more difficult. More notable, though, has been Ukraine's air defense. I won't get into too much detail as this video is already getting long. Also, air defense operations are often kept more secretive, but the systems that have had one of the greatest impact is Buck and then the older Cub. They offer a great mix of both range and mobility. Larger systems, like the S-300, have incredible range, yet very little mobility, and they require a lot of extra vehicles and equipment, making it easier for the enemy to locate and strike. Manpads are incredibly mobile and easy to hide, but they don't have the range or altitude. These two systems alone likely play a huge part in limiting Russia's air force in Ukraine. They force Russian aircraft to fly at extremely low altitudes to avoid being detected and shot down. Flying so low, though, makes it more difficult to find enemy targets, it limits the time you have to aim, see whether your strike was successful, it runs the risk of crashing into the terrain, what they call bomb-activated anti-aircraft fire, and also flying low is less fuel efficient, so it'll shorten the aircraft's total range and how long it could be there. This means that they're not able to provide a lot of close air support for troops on the ground in combat. Strike missions also require a lot of recon and planning, and due to Russia's smaller number of modern surveillance and recon aircraft, and their lack of ability to fly at higher altitudes to locate the enemy due to air defenses, they have not been able to conduct as many strike missions. Those again are mostly assigned to long-range cruise and ballistic missiles, which typically are not as flexible and precise, and depending on how you judge it, can cost a lot more money. And finally, weather is another issue likely impacting how effective their air force is. In the beginning of the war, and again soon with winter approaching, there's a lot of cloud cover over Ukraine. And this was real noticeable while I was looking through satellite imagery of Ukrainian airbases at the beginning of the war. Clouds make it more difficult for reconnaissance from aircraft or satellites to locate enemy positions, and it also degrades some forms of guidance for weapons, such as visual and optical, laser, infrared, and extreme weather can even impact radar and satellite guidance, such as GPS, to some extent. So, in the end, despite having one of the largest air forces in the world, Russia likely just doesn't have a large enough number of aircraft to really make a huge difference in a war against a country as large as Ukraine. And what aircraft they do have are further limited by their failure to destroy Ukraine's air force and air defense network. So, it's not necessarily that it's missing or not being used, they just simply don't have enough, no matter how you cut it.